Hey, Katie. We have Password to Larkspur Lane. We are on Chapter 12, The Crystal Garden. Bess! George exclaimed, horror-stricken. She'll roll into the fire! Nancy scrambled down the hill, George beside her. With a flying leap, she threw herself on Bess and stopped her from rolling. At the same time, George skidded down and caught one of her cousin's flailing arms. The girls lay gasping, only a few feet from the drop-off and the bonfire below. "Bess," Nancy whispered, "are you hurt?" "No," Bess said shakily. "Oh, Nancy, somebody pushed me. If you and George hadn't—" Nancy looked grim. "I think someone mistook you for me, and I don't want him to know he was wrong." As she spoke, 3 counselors hurried down the hill toward them, calling, "What happened? Anybody hurt?" Nancy squeezed George's hand. "We'll pretend I am," she whispered, then closed her eyes. "Yes," George called out. "Nancy Drew! Please hurry. I'm afraid it's bad." "She's unconscious," quavered Bess. Moments later, a husky counselor was carrying Nancy up the hill while one of his companions ran ahead for the camp doctor. "And get Ned Nickerson," George called. 40 minutes later, Ned tenderly placed Nancy on the Cornings' living room couch as Helen's grandmother closed the draperies. "Okay," said Ned. "All clear." Only then did Nancy open her eyes and sit up. "You're some actress, young lady," said Mr. Corning. Nancy smiled. "I didn't have to do anything. Ned and Bess and George were the real actors." Bess giggled. "And the camp director and doctor were good actors, too. Mr. Dennis insisted we use his station wagon to bring Nancy home." "I just hope we fooled the one who pushed Bess," said Nancy. "Morgan must have told the gang you were here," said George. "And one of them trailed us to the camp, waiting for the opportune moment to strike." Ned frowned. "Someone is probably still watching this house. To make our act look really good, we ought to call the doctor for Nancy." Mrs. Corning hurried off to put in the call. Soon she returned, and she reported that Dr. Bennet would be glad to cooperate. Nancy chuckled. "We'll make the gang think I'm out of action. Then they'll pay no more attention to me and I can work freely." George spoke up. "I have a suggestion. If somebody is watching this house, he'll probably plan to speak to Morgan. How about Bess and me letting ourselves out the back door and watching?" "I'll do it," Ned offered. "No," Mr. Corning said. "That would look too suspicious. I often take a little stroll outside before going to bed. In a few minutes one of you can follow me. While I'm out there, no gangster will come to talk to Morgan through the window." He waved aside objections and left the room. His wife said worriedly, "Oh, I hope everything will be all right. But suppose they strike here tomorrow night?" "I have a plan," Nancy replied, "if Ned and Bert and Dave will help us." "Sure we will," said Ned. "It's not our night off, but I know 3 fellows who'll switch with us." "The thieves will probably go for the safe," said Bess. Mrs. Corning shook her head. "I'm afraid they're after something very special. Come," she added, seeing the questioning expressions of her guests. "I'll show you." As their hostess led the way down the hall, Nancy quietly outlined her plan to Ned. "I'll tell the others later." Across the hall from the kitchen, Mrs. Corning opened a door and flicked a wall switch. The room remained dark, but at the far side a tall glass cabinet lighted up. Bess gasped, "Oh, how beautiful!" She and the others stared, amazed. Inside was a sparkling array of crystal flowers and butterflies set on shelves lined with black velvet. "My husband gave me one of each on our wedding anniversaries," Mrs. Corning explained as she led them to the case. "They are made in France. Each flower contains at least one valuable jewel." Nancy noted a ruby glowing in the heart of a rose and a topaz set in a daffodil. The butterflies had diamonds for eyes. "How could the thieves have heard about these?" George asked. "My crystal garden was written up in a magazine some time ago," Mrs. Corning replied. Nancy examined the case carefully. "Do you have a key for this?" Mrs. Corning showed her a tiny gold one which she wore in a chain around her neck. Just then the doctor arrived. He listened to the story of what had happened, then went to check on Morgan, who was much better. When leaving, Dr. Bennet called back through the open door for the benefit of any outside listener. "Miss Drew must remain in bed for at least 48 hours." Ned followed the doctor and went to join Mr. Corning. Inside the house, Nancy said to her friends, "Dr. Bennet played his part well." Then she told them her plans for the next day. Half an hour later, Mr. Corning and Ned returned and reported no prowler near Morgan's window. Ned said good night and returned to Hiawatha. Shortly before dawn, Nancy ate a light breakfast, then slipped into the garage and hid behind the front seat of her car. At 8 o'clock, the other girls came out with a packet of sandwiches. George took the wheel and they drove off. When she was sure they were not being followed, George pulled to the side of the road and Nancy took the driver's seat. "Now for the Larkspur house," she said happily. "But where is it?" Bess asked. Nancy said that since the Tucker estate lay southeast of River Heights and the Pigeon and Airplane both flew over it, the other headquarters were probably to the northwest. "I'll try that anyway." After a while, the road narrowed and there were no houses to be seen. The countryside was generously sprinkled with patches of woodland and open fields. The girls explored every side road. Most of these were merely lumber trails which ended within a short distance. At other times, the searchers found a cabin and inquired if there was a sanatorium in the neighborhood. The answer was always no, and again Nancy would go on. Stopping only to eat their sandwiches, the girls rode all day, exploring the network of winding lanes. All three were tired, their nerves tense with the strain of being constantly on the alert. Finally, Nancy glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 10 minutes past 5, she said. "We'd better go back." Nancy turned the car and began retracing the route to the main highway. Suddenly, she pressed down the brake and they stopped short. "Sorry," Nancy said, "but we just passed a sign that I didn't see when we drove here before." She backed a dozen feet and halted opposite a narrow dirt road. Nailed to a tree was a crude hand-lettered board, L.S. Lane. "What about it?" Bess asked. "That probably leads to the cabin of a lumberman whose name is L.S. Lane." "And on the other hand," said Nancy, "it could mean Larkspur Lane and be a guide for the crooks." "It's worth investigating," George remarked. Nancy turned into the narrow roadway, wide enough for only one car. But here and there the side bank had been cut to allow a vehicle to park while another passed it. Proceeding cautiously over ruts and bumps, Nancy presently pulled into one of the wider places on the right. She stopped the car close to the trees. "This might be the right place, so we'd better go on foot," Nancy said. She led the way among the trees, keeping parallel with the road. The girls trudged through the underbrush for nearly a quarter of a mile, but saw nothing unusual. The only sounds were the crackle of twigs breaking underfoot. Suddenly Nancy halted. "Look!" she exclaimed softly. "Larkspur!" A dozen yards ahead the trees ended. Just beyond was a high wire mesh fence. Inside it grew a long border of exquisite tall larkspur. To the girls' left, a large gate across the lane shut off the entrance to the grounds. Next to it stood a small brown lodge. "This is it!" Nancy whispered gleefully, and her friends nodded. Beyond the gate the ground sloped gently. A gravel roadway led to the top of the rise, where a large white colonial building with a broad veranda was visible among the trees. "It's a beautiful place," Bess said in a low voice. "I can't believe crooks live here." "We'll soon find out," said Nancy. Cautiously, the three girls moved forward, taking advantage of every tree trunk and bush for concealment. There was no sign of habitation. If anyone was inside the gatehouse, he was not to be seen at the moment. Then, for an instant, a flash of white appeared in the distance near the brow of the hill. "Did you see it?" George whispered tensely. "I'm sure it was a nurse's uniform." "Listen, do you hear a plane?" Nancy asked. The girls peered upward. Several minutes passed before the aircraft became visible. Then it shot overhead, flying low. "It's the same type of plane that wounded the bird," Nancy said quickly. "And it's like the one the hotel manager said flew into the Tucker estate. Yes, there is the flying horse on the fuselage. This is the place. Sure enough, said George. Down he goes. The landing field must be behind the house. The plane dipped low, lost altitude rapidly, and vanished behind the roof of the mansion. Now what do we do? Bess asked. There's only one thing left, Nancy answered. Somehow we must get inside. I wonder how they're going to do it. We'll have to find out.